For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motsabi Hwayani. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins Polity to discuss part of the life and times of apartheid struggle legend and global icon Nelson Mandela, in particular his role as a freedom fighter. Professor Suttner, thank you for taking time to share your insights with Polity today.
Thank you.
Mandela said that as a child he was in essence born free, but that as he became exposed to the injustices of the apartheid South Africa, he became a committed freedom fighter. Please provide some detail about Mandela's life journey.
What Nelson Mandela says near the end of his autobiography is that I was not born with a hunger to be free, because in his childhood he had no sense that there was any way that he was restricted. And this is partly because of the environment that he grew up in, where he played around. There was nothing wanting in his life. And it's really only when you encounter oppression, when you encounter whites in oppressive positions, that you have a sense of being unfree. And for most of Mandela's early life, he did not encounter many whites until he went to the Rand in 1941. So what Mandela is indicating by saying that, he's reinforcing the notion of his life as a journey. Mandela is a man who changed a lot during his life. In his early life, he grew up like all other Thembu boys, doing things that boys did on their own. War-type games, rough-type games, things like this. He went through an initiation process, and in this initiation process, it's quite interesting that Mandela tells us that he wasn't as brave as you're supposed to be. And it's quite significant, because Mandela is saying, as an elderly man, to the young boys today, that it's not necessary that you are fearless and do not show that you feel pain. Because I, Nelson Mandela, did not shout out, I am a man, as quickly as I should have done. In this early period of Mandela's life, before he goes to the Rand, he was at school in Clarkbury, Heeltown, and at University of Fort Hare. And during this period, he did see situations where there was a hierarchy, where white principals commanded African teachers. He saw one or two stand up against them. But he himself, and people don't realize this very often, Mandela was not politicized until after 1941. He was at Fort Hare, where many freedom fighters have been, but Mandela was not involved in politics. And he only left Timberland because his guardian, the regent, arranged a marriage for him. Now, until then, Mandela was being trained to be not a leader, but a counselor to the future king of the Thembu people, Sabata Dalindyebo. Consequently, Mandela didn't really develop his leadership capacity till this arranged marriage was presented to him and the regent's son, Justice, and they decided to flee to the Rand. Now, when he arrived on the Rand, you see a major change in Mandela's life. I don't like using this word icon myself, because when you use the word icon, it's really something you cannot explain. Now, Mandela's life is a life that constantly changes. He makes choices and decisions like all of us. Now, icons are not like all of us. Now, when Mandela arrived on the Rand, he met Walter Sisulu, and that changed his life. Walter Sisulu helped him to become a lawyer, and also he got introduced into politics of the ANC Youth League. He also met communists, and that was when his political life started in 1941, although he didn't know much at that point.
All right. So bearing in mind that Mandela's identity can't necessarily be reduced to one single enduring quality, how would we then describe him? Was he a traditionalist or a modernist? Was he an Africanist or a communist? Was he religious or atheist? Or was he a liberator or reconciler?
I don't think it's a question of either or, in the sense that Mandela may have left Timberland, but he had multiple identities. And I think we have to understand people as having more than one identity. In 1962, when Mandela appeared in court, and it's known as the trial where there was a black man in a white man's court, where he refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court, he wore Abatembu beads and other aspects of his Tembu identity. So what Mandela was saying in 1962, 21 years after he left Timberland, is that I'm a freedom fighter. I believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. I'm an African nationalist, but I am also a Tembu. So I think that it doesn't help us to choose identities, because Mandela was many things. He was open. If you look at his life, it is a life of continual changes and learning and willingness to learn, especially from his relationships with people like Walter Sisulu, Moses Kotane, Oliver Tambo, and people like that.
Can you analyze Nelson Mandela from a gender perspective? What is it that we can learn from Nelson Mandela's masculinity that differentiated him from his peers?
I think this is a very important question in South Africa today, when people are claiming to be the heirs of the legacy of Nelson Mandela in a time when we have a lot of violence. And that violence is essentially masculine violence. So that we have to ask ourselves what we can learn from Nelson Mandela as a man. Nelson Mandela is very conscious of being a man. From his early childhood, when he is a boy on the way to becoming a man, and in his initiation, where there's a jarring episode for him when a chief who attends it says, "You think that you are men, but you can never become men as long as you are subjugated under apartheid." So the idea of becoming a man in Mandela's eyes is tied to being free. And some 15, 20 years later, after he led the Defiance campaign, he reflects again and he says, "I felt now that I was a man because I stared the oppressor in his face and did not flinch." Now Mandela's manhood goes through a number of phases. For example, in the 50s, when he's a boxer, you see this idea of a rough, tough masculinity. But at the same time, in his relationship with his wives and his children, you can see a tenderness. Mandela is involved in bathing the children, in sorrows as children die. He buys household groceries, things like this. But Mandela gets more and more involved in the struggle, preparing for underground and for armed struggle, a sort of heroic phase. But most heroism, male heroism, tends to consign women to the home. Now Mandela encouraged his first wife, Evelyn, to pursue her nursing career and become a midwife. He encouraged her to be involved in the nursing union. His second wife, Winnie, whatever ambiguities there may be, also had her own political life. Now Mandela got involved in the armed struggle that can be taken as an example of a tough masculinity. He went to jail for that. The period in jail was a period when I think the passionate Mandela learnt to tame his passion, and he also showed us when he came out that he recognized that there was a time to fight, but when there was a time when you could reason in order to achieve peace, he was prepared to take that road. And he embodied that in the way he communicated to others. For example, when Mandela came out, the toi-toi was in vogue. Now, the toi-toi is a militaristic type of song where people stamp their feet and dance around. It's mainly a masculine song, and the words are very aggressive, like shoot, shoot to kill the Boer, hit them, etc., etc. Now, when Mandela joined in what is called the Madiba Shuffle, in a sense, he was smiling and communicating to all South Africans that the South Africa that he wanted to see was inclusive. He didn't embrace the language of violence. When it was necessary to fight, he fought. When it was necessary to reconcile and show white South Africans that there was a place for them, provided they accepted equality, he showed that not just in words, but in the symbolism that is associated with him. He showed also that he could be tough, but also gentle, as in his love of children, who he spontaneously embraced.
Professor, you highlight Walter Sisulu as a significant role model in Nelson Mandela's life. Why do you think that he was such an influential part of that feature?
Walter Sisulu, and when I smile, I just smile because I love the man. Walter Sisulu was an extraordinary person. When he met Mandela, he was an estate agent, and it's very hard to imagine him being a successful estate agent. And he says when he saw Mandela, he recognized that this was a man that they needed in the ANC. But he first helped Mandela to become a lawyer. He arranged for him to get articles at a legal firm. And in the years that followed, they worked together, and Mandela, when he came to the Rand, was really a country bumpkin. And Sisulu helped to politicize him. Sisulu only had standard 4 or 5 education, but he was very, very wise. And I think throughout his life, Mandela understood that he needed to check out what he wanted to do with Sisulu. Mandela tended to be impetuous, tended to act quickly. Sisulu used to listen and give his answers very slowly. And if Mandela had made up his mind to do something and people wanted to persuade him not to do it, they would bring in Tata Sisulu, who would be able to reason with him. And just about all the time, Mandela would listen. I think that in politics, you have to have an understanding of what is tactically important, what you can do now, but also the long-term effects of what you do. Now, the strength of Sisulu, I'm not saying Mandela was not strategic, but Sisulu's main strength was strategic. Also, he was a person who, because his temperament was more laid back and slow, he could reach out to people that Mandela couldn't always reach out to. In the Youth League, for example, Mandela is notorious for having broken up meetings, pushed people off the stage, people in the Communist Party and the Indian Congress. Now, Sisulu was the first of the Youth League people to realize that you needed to get allies from other organizations and other population groups.
That was researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner discussing Nelson Mandela and some of the factors that contributed towards his ascension into the struggle to reconcile a divided nation into a rainbow nation.